This is a Direct News Special Edition. DIR Broadcasting presents the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
I live in a small valley. There's one main street, 5 street lights, 2 juvenile delinquents. If you look at the people that are pro-nuke, you're looking at the same folks that brought you Vietnam. The anti-nuke movement has the legacy of the 60s behind it. The most valuable contribution made in the 60s was that you can fight City Hall.
Won't you please come to Chicago?
We're going down, man. Let's go. All we will do is move forward, and if they lock us up, we lock it up, and God give us the breath to kick off. Let's go.
Writer, psychologist, civil rights worker, counterculture spokesperson, anti-war activist, and fugitive, Abbie Hoffman. The Abbie Hoffman tapes. His first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years. A Direct News Special Edition brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. And we'll be right back with part 1 after this. This is a Direct News Special Edition. I'm Scott Muni. The 60s, free speech demonstrations, the Ban the Bomb movement, civil rights marches, college campus disorders, the anti-war movement, rock and roll, drugs, the hippies and the yippies. Abbie Hoffman, America's best-known fugitive, was right in the middle of all of it, throwing money down on Wall Street brokers at the New York Stock Exchange, marching in Mississippi, fighting in the streets of Chicago. Abbie Hoffman had written several books, Woodstock Nation, Revolution for the Hell of It, and Steal This Book. And it was while he was doing research for another book that he claims he was set up in a 3-pound cocaine bust. Abbie jumped bail rather than risk a mandatory life sentence under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. He vanished into the underground in early 1974, and he hasn't made an overt public appearance since then. Late last year, Direct News decided to try and contact Abbie Hoffman for an interview. Word went out to people with underground connections, and months later, Abbie called Direct News and agreed to talk. After a series of cloak and dagger security arrangements, he met in a sleazy Times Square hotel with Direct News producer Chris Stanley and associate producer Sandra Furton. Abbie Hoffman talked for hours about his life underground, his politics, and his legal hassles. This is part 1 in a series of 5 excerpts, and Abbie Hoffman talks about what his life is like now.
She has seen me changing. It ain't easy rearranging, and it gets harder as you get older. Farther away as you get closer.
If I'm a little nervous, it's actually because I'm coming from the country to the city. There is definitely a culture shock from where I live. It's about, I live in a small valley. There's 1 main street, 5 street lights, 2 juvenile delinquents. Well, one's too old now, so I guess we got 1 juvenile delinquent, so it's real heartland, and it's a very different kind of consciousness. So it's quite a shock. When you come in, you can see your feet at night. I mean, that's one of the first things that's a little weird. It's no country road, and just about a year and a half ago, they set up a proposal for a nuclear plant, so I became an activist. So they look at me as like I'm really swift and fast, and I'm not afraid of the bureaucrats and government and all this stuff. And another thing that I noticed, the difference between a city and a country, is I'm not afraid of the phone. I mean, you sit in the country and the telephone rings, and the people immediately go, and they jump back from it. They're afraid, In the city, your phone doesn't ring and you start sweating, It doesn't ring for 10 minutes. So there's a whole different consciousness that goes on between us coming here.
I understand you were in the crowd at the May 6th Coalition March in Washington. Some fellow I spoke to, I was backstage talking to people, and somebody that I spoke to said, "Hey, I just talked to this guy in the crowd." I said he was Abbie Hoffman.
Yes, I had come with, I had been organizing, like I say, against this proposed nuclear plant. It was much easier for me as Abbie to talk about it before 3 Mile Island. But if I start to give you more details, you can start narrowing down to where I am, because there aren't that many at this particular stage. So it's kind of hard to talk about because the other person has been pretty active. I mean, he's been on television, he's given speeches and everything, and organized in barrooms, hunting lodges, things like that. And So I came to that demonstration really as two people to get two votes. Actually, one's almost a Republican. To tell you the truth, 'cause the area is so conservative. Where I am, a lot of the arguments are just in terms of local control and fighting the federal bureaucracy. And it's so strange being when we started the committee, everybody was so excited, and they said, one person remarked, "Oh, if only Rennie Davis was here." It was really, I agreed inside. He was good, and they were all excited. The 60s are coming back, and for me, it was incredible. It's an incredible experience.
How did you feel when you saw the size of the crowd?
It was I'd say our local committee is a little different, and our local effort's a little different than that audience, because that audience was like almost a trip back in 10 years, because they were like 80% what you'd call hippies, I suppose. I mean, they did look like hippies, huh? Much more than I had expected. Much more. Our local committee is more farmers, property owners. They're more like middle-aged people. I thought these people were kind of young. The backpacking. It's not like that, at least on our local level. It's not fought that way. So I was surprised at that, and then as Abbie, I was pretty moved. Actually. I was very moved. And I went backstage. I saw a lot of my friends, many of them in the government, in high positions, and they were saying they didn't exactly relate to me as common criminal or something, fugitive. And this was, you definitely had the feeling at this time going to Washington with anti-nukes that you're on the side of the angels. And that's one thing to oppose your government's policy. Also, I think most of the people in that crowd had just been activated as a result of 3 Mile Island. But, of course, what's interesting, if you look at the people that are pro-nuke, you're looking at the same folks that brought the Vietnam War, and they're pretty well lined up, the same kind of mentality and the same forms of decision-making that I at least are opposing, and for the same reasons. And I think there's a definite connection between the two. I would have gone to Shoreham, in fact, and I called up my friend Jerry Rubin and asked him if he would go and everything, and now he's speaking quite a lot against, nukes and nuclear weapons and more nuke plants going up. So, yeah, I think we're going to, in 2 or 3 years, we're going to see rallies and demonstrations much bigger than anything that happened in the 60s. There's too much money invested in the nuclear plants. It's like $35 billion in the ground and another $88 billion on the planning boards, and they're not about, the vested interests already have it in motion, and they're not about to stop just because some people, say nice things or sing songs or do all that. Nuclear power, like all other forms of power favored by a corporate state, concentrates power in the hands of a few. And I look forward to this summer possibility of a blackout. That's not because of just some human or mechanical error. I mean, I'm saying that I fear conspiracy in terms of that's the great fear, the blackout. I mean, I've had nuclear scientists say to me in debates, you're marching now, but wait till you see New York City without 3 weeks of electricity. And they're all gearing up to the point where, that's something they could do. It's interesting how they see it. They say, you know what you people cause us to do? You cause us to hire 10 public relations persons for every new plant under consideration. And they look at that march in Washington and they say, this is $2.5 million worth of primetime advertising. They don't measure it in terms of people for and against. They measure it in terms of a war of publicity. How much do they have to spend to counteract that demonstration? And that means how much time do they have to buy on TV? They don't sit and think, well, how can we put this referendum before the people? How can we have demonstrations and bring all the people that... They don't think of the democratic ways. They think, how much money can we spend on television to brainwash the people so they'll believe it, We got to get Johnny Cash to go out and drink some mobile gas, and different things like that. I mean, they just do it. So they use the cultural modes like radio and television, and they use the cultural modalities like music and celebrities and singers, and they're going to respond. You're going to respond. The next few years, you're going to see a lot of, how nice, how nice the Seven Sisters. In my way of thinking, the Seven Sisters have replaced Big Brother. In 1984, it's going to be 7 sisters. Once it's known, it's no secret anymore. So people know about it now, thanks to China Syndrome and 3 Mile Island.
Well, the last poll that was taken, though, indicates that there's still like 43% of the people in favor of nuclear power as opposed to 42% against. Now, that was after Harrisburg, before the demonstration, though.
But that's not, because since it is the president's position, about 40% of people always are going to support the government's position on anything. If they said the moon was made out of green cheese, you'd get 40% of the people. So 42% is really not that much. And more people are opposed. And when this next accident, I mean, this is going to grow. Don't forget, the awareness of all this is just starting to filter down. But we still haven't seen something of the level of a teaching brought to a national level. We haven't gotten to the point where we're into national referendums about, nuclear power, these kinds of issues. But the anti-nuke movement has the legacy of the 60s behind it. You see, that's probably the most valuable contribution made in the 60s. Was that you can fight City Hall. I know in the 60s, when we didn't have any real history. Not that there wasn't. I'll tell you, after I was a radical for about a dozen years, and then I learned the history. See, I wasn't taught it. I mean, I grew up through the 1950s. I didn't know the Rosenbergs were executed. I didn't know there was a depression. I didn't know Sacco and Vanzetti. I came from Boston. I didn't know Sacco and Vanzetti happened. I didn't know any of these things, that blacks were lynched. And I got A. I was a smart kid. I got A in all these courses, civics and everything. So what was I taught? So now I think, though, with the young kids, they saw it. I mean, they saw us. They know this. You can't shut it up. The 60s just got too big. So I think in that respect, they're starting from a higher level of consciousness, and we all are. I am too.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes. This is Direct News, and we'll be back with a final word after this. Next, on the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
There were hundreds of cars. My God. They were all over. I heard from one of the people who worked at the maids or something in the hotel that they had police on all the rooftops up and down that block.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes, a Direct News special edition, brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. This program was produced by Chris Stanley and Wendy Maxwell. Executive producers, Bob Meyerowitz and Peter Kalf. For Direct News in New York, Sandra Furton and Amy Gitlin. I'm Scott Muni. Direct News is a service of DIR Broadcasting. This is a Direct News special edition. DIR Broadcasting presents the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
They had police on all the rooftops up and down that block.
Power to the people.
I'm a dissident. I'm a dissident writer.
By the time we got to Woodstock,
I think I'm going to get caught.
won't you please come to Chicago?
If we're going to jail, man, let's go. All we will do is move forward, and if they lock us up, we lock it up, and God give us the breath to keep going. Let's go.
Writer, psychologist, civil rights worker, counterculture spokesperson, anti-war activist, and fugitive, Abbie Hoffman. The Abbie Hoffman tapes, his first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years. A Direct News special edition brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. And we'll be right back with part 2 after this. This is a Direct News special edition. I'm Scott Muni. Abbie Hoffman is America's best-known fugitive. He was a standout character in the turbulent 60s, involved in the civil rights, ban the bomb, and anti-war movements. He had written handbooks for revolutionary action. He was a leading defendant in the landmark Chicago 7 trial. He and Jerry Rubin co-founded the Youth International Party, the Yippies. Then, in 1973, things changed. Abbie was researching a book on American outlaws when, as he tells it, he was set up and busted on cocaine dealing charges. And in early 1974, he jumped bail and vanished into the underground rather than risk a mandatory life sentence under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. He's made no overt public appearances since then. Now he lives in an unnamed small town, organizing against nuclear power and writing. His just completed autobiography, titled Soon to Be a Major Motion Picture, will be published this winter. Last December, Direct News decided to contact Abbie Hoffman to see if he'd agree to be interviewed. And after months of arrangements and security precautions, Abbie met with Direct News producer Chris Stanley and associate producer Sandra Furton in a sleazy hotel in New York's Times Square. This is Abbie Hoffman's first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years. And in part 2, he talks about the drug bust that left him a fugitive.
Well, it was in a hotel room just like this. Not too far from here. All of a sudden, the wallpaper just came alive, I'll tell you. God, were they ever happy. You don't know how many people I made happy that day. There were hundreds of cars. My God. They were like all over. I heard from one of the people who worked at the maids or something in the hotel that they had police on all the rooftops up and down that block. I mean, they got me in the hall and they said, like, what, with the shotgun there? You know, pump the old macho, pump the... Go ahead, buddy. I'll give you a chance. I had a lot of cops do that to me. Once I became famous, when the cops came up to me, I'd always notice the emotions were always, you know, like... they play Bat Star, or they play, these tough guys, they finger their holster, and they grab their gun all the time to, waiting for me to draw on them.
And they would actually say things to you like that, go ahead, you want to try and get away, They said things like that?
Oh, yes. I've had police say, this bullet's got your name, I'm getting you in the street tonight. But I think that, say the police would come right in here, I'd have to go up and immediately do this almost Zen kind of a thing, like, that's okay, don't worry about it, everything's going to be all right, because I'll get shot. Right. I'll just get shot, because they attribute so much power that they translate the power in terms of guns. That's, if I was president, and I am running, I've been running for 5 years now, so obviously I'm running, I think it's the first law I'd do is to take away the guns from the cops. Except my own little police force, of course, 26,000 elite.
You're coming down the street. You're coming right down the middle. You gotta keep the beat. But as blue as the ocean. Now the sun shines down. Now their feet hardly touch the ground. Jolly coppers on parade. Jolly coppers on parade.
One reason that I went underground was because I've been in jails a lot, and I was. It had nothing to do with the bust itself. The police know that I wasn't a central figure. Most people, by this time, with this kind of an arrest, the charges are dropped after you've been underground. They consider going underground a punishment. So you often hear people have been under 5, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. The charges are, they're dropped, or they're given some kind of suspended sentence. The police know I wasn't central. They know, for example, there have been pretrial hearings where it shows that the police involved illegal wiretap and all this. When I was busted, I was convinced we could win the case, even with the temperament of the times there. Now, this was on the eve of the Rockefeller drug laws. There was like mass hysteria at that particular moment. Also, cocaine at the time was definitely the same as heroin. I mean, they brought in, I remember the first judge's hearings, the judge said, well, there's 17 deaths this year alone from cocaine, and my lawyer and the people went out and they found out that 9 of those deaths, they jumped off buildings, a few others had bullet holes in them, things like that. There was like one person who tried to eat about 3 pounds of coke or something when the police were coming, and maybe that was a coke death, But the whole history of drugs, if you read the Consumer's Report called Licit and Illicit Drugs, is a great case to be made for all illicit drugs being made legal and all legal drugs being made illegal. And it's strictly political decisions. And if you study the whole history, you understand that. But this was a particularly hysterical moment in New York City. With my reputation, with one book on the street already, even telling people how to do this, steal this book and everything, which is, kind of an outlaw handbook. And with the second one in the process, that's how I got busted. I was interviewing one of the people who was giving me some information about dealing for a sequel to Steal This Book. And all this, I But still, I was going to go on trial. And it was my experience in the tombs. The prosecutor in the case asked for $500,000 bail on me, saying that this crime was more heinous than murder. Now that prosecutor is a law partner of one of my lawyers and goes into court every day and argues that coke is harmless. So that gives a very graphic illustration of what the law is about. So he asked for all this bail. Before the bail came down, I was in the tombs for 6 weeks. It was the hottest summer in New York. There was a huge fight. I saw people have a fight, two gangs, the Muslims and the non-Muslims, and got pretty violent. And one person picked up one of these, the things that you squeeze the mops out with. I don't know what the squeezer is, we'll call it. The shit on the end, a heavy metal thing. And just whacked it across the guy's face, ripped his eye out. His eye was hanging out by nerve endings. The other guy was dragged out by the guards. He'd been stabbed, and he was just yanked across the floor. There was one guy that died 3 cells down, and they said it was suicide, and everybody had their doubts about that. Geraldo Rivera wanted to interview me at the time. I remembered, and I said, I'll only do it up here, because down there, you see, was where you did in the public. It looks like any regular school or a social welfare center, nice neon lights and everything. Up there was rats and cockroaches and bloody fights, and I said, I'm just not going to, I'm just going. First chance I get, I'm going.
And you did.
And Anita, my wife, and the kid came to see me. I just said, going swimming, baby.
What's going to happen now? I mean, how are you going to... Do you figure that they're still heartily after you?
Yes, they definitely keep looking. They were looking very, very hard until... it's a political decision. When Carter came in, they started to look less and less. It's quite strange to go as an outlaw down to the May 6th, and there were several people who were working in the government who came over to me, and some very high up, I won't say, because we're close friends. I've actually hid out at people's houses coast to coast that you couldn't imagine. They cover the full spectrum. When people read this book, if they, see every single person in that book has helped me out.
How are you going to get out of this? Is the question. You just going to wait? You're going to wait for the next president, or what are you going to do?
How am I going to get out? All right, let's see.
I'm sure you've pondered this a few times. How are you going to get out of this situation? You say you set up.
Have the charges dropped.
How are you going to have the charges dropped and so you can surface again?
Well, I'm never sure I would want to, in a sense, become the other person, come back.
Well, you couldn't do that anyway now, could you? I mean, because you're not the other person anymore.
Well, one fantasy I have is that in about 5 years, everybody but these two cops is going to know who I am, know where I live. There's going to be one shoe from the FBI down there, trying to, where they're going to say, he's going to say, I know where he is, and his boss going to say, you schmuck. But I hope after people read the book, they'll see that, number one, people who've taken a drug bust and who have been underground are generally pardoned. The charges are dropped. Some arrangements have been made, and there's been there's been no attempt to make any kind of arrangement with me. And that I'm a dissident. I'm a dissident writer. I think I am being sort of persecuted, all right, because I stay active. Because I talk, because I write articles, and because I haven't changed. I haven't said I'm sorry. If I said if I discovered Christ, the Chase Manhattan Bank, and Capital, if I just like said it's I'd be tomorrow. I'd be above ground. I'd be released. They just say, come on back. Not only would they say, come on back, they'd give me a TV show. They'd put me on TV to go tell that story. But those are not my beliefs. I haven't changed since the 60s. I still think we're living in a pretty corrupt system. I think it's unjust more than, I think that's more important. And I'd rather see it just. And I'm going to continue working, whether I'm another person or this or that. And even the return, those are political decisions, because I'm a part of a movement.
Are you prepared to stay underground for the rest of your life if you have to?
I think I'm going to get caught. I always carry that. I always figure it's a healthier attitude, rather than thinking I'm not going to get caught, and I'm a little less cautious. So I always think I am going to get caught. Now more than ever, because I am active in the local community, and I'm very, I'm scared. Every day I, in a sense, go to work, do my job, which is, this local community. I mean, they're really into the work I'm doing, and I know, they'll all be here to testify, and, once that story's known, it's going to look good and everything. They're probably going to, I don't know, they might make me mayor.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes. This is Direct News, and we'll be back with a final word after this. Next, on the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
Your cousin died, right? Your country's the cousin. Your cousin died. There, somebody opens the door and says, this guy's a minister. Minister Ford. This is Minister Carter. He can come in. You don't throw him out.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes, a Direct News special edition, brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. This program was produced by Chris Stanley and Wendy Maxwell. Executive producers, Bob Meyerowitz and Peter Kalf. For Direct News in New York, Sandra Furton and Amy Gitlin. I'm Scott Muni. Direct News is a service of DIR Broadcasting. This is a Direct News special edition. DIR Broadcasting presents the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
I consider myself a revolutionary, and I believe in revolution as a process. Marijuana and rock music did more to stop the Vietnam War than any organized left group that I can name.
By the time we got to Woodstock,
It's very strange to be wanted equally by the FBI and Warner Brothers.
won't you please come to Chicago?
We're going to jail, man. Like, let's go. All we will do is move forward, and if they lock us up, we lock it up, and God give us the breath to kick off. Let's go.
Writer, psychologist, civil rights worker, counterculture spokesperson, anti-war activist, and fugitive, Abbie Hoffman. The Abbie Hoffman tapes, his first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years, a Direct News special edition brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. And we'll be right back with part 3 after this. This is a Direct News special edition. I'm Scott Muni. Abbie Hoffman is America's best-known fugitive. A standout character of the turbulent 60s, Abbie was involved in the civil rights, ban the bomb, and anti-war movements. He wrote revolutionary handbooks, co-founded the Yippies, and was a defendant in the landmark Chicago 7 conspiracy trial. In late 1973, Abbie was busted on cocaine dealing charges. He jumped bail and vanished into the underground rather than face a mandatory life sentence under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. Abbie says the bust was a setup, and he's written about it and his underground life in an autobiography to be published this winter. It's called Soon to Be a Major Motion Picture. Last December, Direct News decided to contact Abbie Hoffman. Word was passed to people with underground connections, and months later, Abbie agreed to do his first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years. After a series of cloak and dagger security arrangements, he met with Direct News producer Chris Stanley and associate producer Sandra Furton in a sleazy hotel in New York's Times Square, and he talked for hours about his life and his politics. Abbie lives under an alias in an unnamed small town, writing and organizing citizens against a proposed nuclear plant. He's still active, and he talks about the legacy of the 60s and what it means to America's future.
When you look back on those times, when you look back on the 60s, and everybody's running up and down the street, jumping up and down, going, 60s are dead, the 60s are dead. Do you feel that there's been a simmering down?
Somewhat, but, there would have been U.S. troops in Iran right off the bat. There was just no question. If the 60s hadn't happened, there would have been troops in Iran fighting right now today. there was a major trauma that occurred in that period. Cultural splits, the birth of feminism, the race, birth of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. I mean, it's unprecedented in the history of Western military history that a population rose up against its own government's foreign war. It just never happened before. So there was major divisions. You talked about Chicago. This was a scene I sort of acted out as a scenario in the book where the family was home watching television of what was going on in Chicago, and the police were beating the yippies, and the announcers, of course, scolding and speaking this fatherly term. It was the first night. It kept changing night after night. The media kept getting a little more... As soon as they started beating up all the reporters, then things started changing in America, But people at the dinner table would watch, and you'd have the patriarch father saying, "Get those scummy bastards off the street," and the young people would just silently, they'd go get their money, and they'd sneak out the house and get on a plane and come. They come to Chicago. I mean, there was civil war going on in families. So, of course, in the 70s, you wanted a period of post-operative care. And if you think of the presidents, Ford and Carter, and I see Carter's practically the Democratic version of Ford, they're nice smiles, probably honest, decent, God-fearing men, the kind of guys, if they opened the operating doors and said, "These are the guys that are going to stitch you up," you wouldn't throw them out. Your cousin died, right? Your country's the cousin. Your cousin died. Somebody opens the door and says, "This guy's a minister. Minister Ford. This is Minister Carter." He can come in. You don't throw him out. I don't think it's going to do for the future. I don't think it's going to do for addressing the problems in the country. So I think there's great, cynicism, despair, and those are the kinds of things that the mass media would like you to believe. You see the Big Fix movie. I have particular interest in that because it was pictured me as an advertising executive in the suburbs. And I don't know if you read the piece.
I saw the film and I saw your piece in The Voice, but talk about that because there's a lot of people who didn't. You were when the detective character in the book, who's moving through the underground, finally, the Richard Dreyfuss in the film, finally discovers the Abbie Hoffman character. Mm-hmm. He is hiding out up in the hills, I guess it is, somewhere in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills. He's got his little grill out in the back. He looks clean-shaven. He's working for an advertising agency and justifies the entire thing with a family and a swimming pool.
Yes. Could not the person who invented "Don't Trust Anybody Under 30" invent cereal and soda pop jingles? Which, of course, the answer is yes. As I wrote in the article, I said that was child's play. I mean, I used to hang out, with a lot of advertising each advertising agency back, say, 66-ish, 67, hippie days, birth of the counterculture. Each house had their freak. They would even call that the house freaks. Even radio stations did that too. Every corporation had to have their house freak. I remember a dinner at Max's Kansas City, sponsored by the Electric Circus and some other people. It was about $3,000 to come to the dinner. And who sent representatives? Schick, the U.S. Army, Chase Manhattan Bank, Alcoa. I mean, all the big corporations was sending them down. They got a little box with some beads in it, some incense, a psychedelic cube, some rolling paper, and then they did this whole thing, about what it is to be hip, and it was sort of the start of the corruption. I mean, the co-optation. We always call that, the hip, the form without the content, so to speak.
How did you feel about that when you saw that happening? Because it was beginning when you went underground, and it's really just moved on to where everything is a parody of itself, and it's all used up, and the feeling, the trappings of the spirit, not the spirit itself, but the trappings of the spirit. How did you feel when you saw that happen?
Certainly not bitter. Certainly not any of those. I really don't have those reactions, or I would have been disillusioned long ago. So I'm not prone to those kind of reactions. I consider myself a revolutionary, and I believe in revolution as a process. It's almost like somebody who has a relationship with God believes in their relationship with their God, but not with any church. So I don't believe that there's any churches, so I don't look for models in countries. So I'm not upset when, like, somebody dies in a country and the next thing you know, somebody dies and, you know, they can't publish this book. Oh, things change, or some of the socialist countries or in some of the groups or organizations, because I don't expect to see certain kinds of models because I see revolution as a process. So when I see something like Madison Avenue take over the counterculture, I almost expect that to sort of happen continuously, and I think that those are some of the intricacies and things that make America such an interesting country to work in, that's all. It's very strange to be wanted equally by the FBI and Warner Brothers.
How far along then are we in this process? I mean, if you're talking about it as a process, the pendulum swings forward at the end of the 60s, the pendulum swings back at the end of the beginning of the 70s.
Co-optation of culture is a yin-yang proposition, of course. You know, it's like a sponge and it gets absorbed, and then there's part of the culture and you move on, and it's more evolutionary, I suppose, than revolutionary. But the music and the counterculture did allow for a certain kind of community sense of feeling, which was instrumental in stopping the Vietnam War, too. Marijuana and rock music did more to stop the Vietnam War than any organized left group that I can name.
But
Really got the troops in Vietnam.
But in the last 10 years, it seems like the corporate America has solidified itself in a way that you couldn't even fathom at the end of the 60s, and that very little's been done about that. So, I mean, how much progress was made just because the war stopped?
One of the reasons was, I think, because they've become more sophisticated, especially in the use of television. We were trained, we were brought up on television, so we came to the Vietnam War a TV generation, whereas the people who were running it, you see, were not they were a newspaper generation. So now that's been moving a little, and that distinction isn't just made. The people that are in control of the media, so to speak, are more culturally attuned and a little more sophisticated, I suppose, and a little different. I mean, you know, that cooptation works two ways. Rome conquered Greece, and they ended up all speaking Greek in Rome, you know, and having Greek teachers and Greek culture.
But the hardware lurches along by itself, and whether you have people on the inside who are gumming up the works or not, maybe that just makes the hardware more confused and more likely to just blast out in unknown ways, you know? It's not under control anymore. There's nothing, I mean, even corporate America doesn't seem to be under control anymore.
Well, I think it is under control because it's guided by the profit motive. So therefore, although it's not a monolith, there is a concept of the ruling class. It's a concept that nobody ever talks about. I mean, you're not allowed to use words like ruling class and capitalism, even to talk about class, actually, because in mass media, you like to think of everybody as out there listening to your station, smoking your cigarettes, and, you know, and that's it. And you work towards that and build to it. So if you say there's different classes, you're immediately defeating your purpose. So the whole idea of capitalism is to build a homogeneous whole. There's communism, too. It's to build, the masses, too. So they don't like to admit things like class and those things. There's no real analysis of America that goes on in terms of the media. So the more entertainment and the less education you can plug in, the more control you have, the more distraction, the more disco. And, you know, you just have disco inside and out. You have interior disco going on in everybody's head, so... So what? But the situations stay the same. Things start to cost more. People don't get as much as for working. They keep getting fired. They don't have unions. They don't have any representation. People around the world demanding whatever their natural resources are, copper, oil, they're going to keep it. They've seen Vietnam. You know, they got the lesson from Vietnam. If we didn't get the lesson, the rest of the world did.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes. This is Direct News, and we'll be back with a final word after this. Next, on the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
I wrote Revolution for Hell in 1968, 11 years ago. In the back of the book, there's a section called the Yippie Demands. And there's 18 of those. And I think 10 out of the 18 have already occurred.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes, a Direct News special edition, brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. This program was produced by Chris Stanley and Wendy Maxwell. Executive producers, Bob Meyerowitz and Peter Kalf. For Direct News in New York, Sandra Furton and Amy Gitlin. I'm Scott Muni. Direct News is a service of DIR Broadcasting. This is a Direct News Special Edition. DIR Broadcasting presents the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
Till I see military forces, American military forces fighting abroad, I'll say that the 60s isn't dead. As it was then, as it is now, as it will be in 10 years, the future's up for grabs.
By the time we got to Woodstock,
The first tenet of revolutionary life is to be optimistic. You have to believe in change.
won't you please come to Chicago?
We're going to jail, man, like, let's go. All we will do is move forward, and if they lock us up, we lock it up, and God give us the breath to keep going. Let's go.
Writer, psychologist, civil rights worker, counterculture spokesperson, anti-war activist, and fugitive, Abbie Hoffman. The Abbie Hoffman tapes, his first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years, a Direct News special edition brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. And we'll be right back with part 4 after this. This is a Direct News special edition. I'm Scott Muni. Abbie Hoffman is America's best-known fugitive. A standout character of the turbulent 60s, Hoffman's involvement in the anti-war movement made him a culture hero. He wrote revolutionary handbooks, organized B-ins and smoke-ins, co-founded the Yippies, and was a defendant in the infamous Chicago 7 conspiracy trial. In late 1973, Abbie was researching a book on American outlaws when he was busted while middlemaning a 3-pound cocaine deal. Abbie claims it was a setup, and he jumped bail and vanished into the underground rather than risk a mandatory life sentence under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. He hasn't made an overt public appearance since. Last December, Direct News decided to try contacting Abbie to see if he'd come out of hiding for a broadcast interview. Months went by. Abbie got the word, and finally in mid-June, after some cloak and dagger security arrangements, he met with Direct News producer Chris Stanley and associate producer Sandra Furton. For 2.5 hours in a sleazy Times Square hotel in New York, Abbie Hoffman talked about his life underground, his politics, and his legal hassles. This is part 4 of a 5-part series of excerpts from that interview. In part 3, Abbie talked about the legacy of the 60s and how that legacy is inspiring the fast-growing anti-nuclear movement. Continuing that discussion, presidential candidate Abbie Hoffman gives the only address he can give, his State of the Union address.
Things are accepted. For example, in the book, I have a lot to say about Andy Warhol's famous dictum that everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes. It's easy for him to say because all his friends are going to be famous for 15 minutes. They're all rich, they're all famous, they're all the beautiful people. But I'll tell you, that's 1% of the population, and they're not all going to be famous. We're not all going to be famous for 15 minutes. I'll tell you what everybody out there listening is going to be for 15 minutes. They're going to be broke. That's what they're going to be. They're going to be broke for 15 minutes. They're going to have a great anxieties about their jobs. They're going to be fine. I have a friend of mine. He's a traveling salesman. Okay, childhood friend. He's like honorary sheriff in his area, whatever. He put me up one night. We're traveling through the country. He puts me up. Okay, he tells me, look, I'm getting, he's a little older than me, he's about 47. He says, the next 5 years are crucial for me and my company. I've been there 25 years, and right now is a period they start firing the people so they won't, once they hit 55, then they start collecting their pensions and securities. So it's real shaky for him these 4 years. And he's a total nervous wreck. He's a typical American. See, he's a typical American. There's a large percentage of the population right here in New York City that has 20 times the chances of ending up in prison or a mental hospital that they do of ending up in college. 20 times the chances. That's incredible. So you see, those are the kind of chances. Not that they're going to be famous. Hey, you're going to be famous, you know.
So the question is, Abbie, the question is, what is the possibility in this society, the evolution of this society, of having the kind of revolution that you talked about 10 years ago? From what's grown from that till now, is it still possible to have that kind of revolution here? Or what, if there was something like that, would it resemble anything that you would recognize as a governmental structure?
Okay, I wrote Revolution for Hell in 1968, 11 years ago. In the back of the book, there's a section called the Yippie Demands. And there's 18 of those. And I think there were like a few, like if you don't count the 3 or 4 real utopian ones, like the abolition of money was one and a couple others. 10 out of the 18 have already occurred. Is something like that.
Include the abolition of money?
No, with the abolition of paid toilets. Pretty well moved along. That was one of the demands. And the abolition of the Vietnam War stopped. The abolition of the draft. All ecology issues are now being raised that were raised then. A women's movement. You know, gay movements, a sexual preference. You know, there was a whole section about that. And there's a whole re-examination of the role of government. And I mean, I don't know. I'm optimistic. I'm not... like I say, I wasn't bitter then. I'm not bitter now. The first tenet of revolutionary life is to be optimistic. You have to believe in change. It's a matter of faith. It's a matter of faith. My faith isn't shattered. To the contrary. I mean, I go to Washington. I just saw 100,000 people there. And there are no nuclear plants being built right now. They're all in abeyance. And as it was then, as it is now, as it will be in 10 years, the future's up for grabs. And it's just a question of how one's stance wants to be made. I could have been that guy in the Hill in Big Fix.
You could have been here.
I could have done that several times. Oh yes, I could have done that a lot of times. Right after the trial, I was offered several jobs and opportunities. I could have made $1 million, and $1 million was a lot in those days. That was big money, and I could have made it right off, and I didn't, and I could have done it since, even now, I could have done it. It's just that, you know, the reason's real simple. It's not like have anything to do with any kind of martyrdom or things like that, or sainthood and everything. I grew up with a lot of these people, you know, like that. His name was Howie Epps in the film. A lot of those people. And I visit them. If I come in to somebody and visit them now, you know what they do? The first thing, they tell me all their troubles. They tell me how bad it's going, how things are, you know, they don't mind their guilt. And I mean, it's just not working. It's just not working for them. And I think that kind of basic compromise. I'm not talking about mini compromises or any of those things. You know, there's great latitude in my mind about how people can work out their own individual karmas and lives and everything. But I'm talking about major compromises where you feel that your heart is going this way, but your security is going to go in the opposite direction because that's what's good for the kids or for the yard or for your security, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And that sort of status climb, I saw it as very unhappy and self-defeating, so that's what I rejected in a certain way. So I was different than in the Big Fix.
Yeah.
Because there I was reading it, you know, about this $150,000 executive, and I was, you know, a cook, and I was still giving up most of my time to be an activist in a local movement, and the activism was giving me great joy. It was a lot of fun.
Well, then my summary question is, with all, I'm not trying to be on a pessimistic side, but with all of these things that are going on now, difficulty in getting ERA passed, the rise of the corporate state and all this time, the little sword rattling that keeps going on. Let's not forget the Seven Sisters. Well, that's the sword rattling, you know, the threat that we're going to wind up defending the Saudi Arabian oil fields someday instead of President Tu. All of this stuff is still happening. You still feel we're making forward progress after all this time, that our rate of progress hasn't slowed so considerably that we're not going to make it.
Before 1970, the United States was involved in 184 imperialist military ventures in the country's history. Less than 200 years, 184, just about one a year. In other words, there was always troops going out someplace. We didn't like what they were doing in Lebanon, we send the troops. We didn't like what they were doing in Dominican Republic, we send the troops. We didn't like what they were doing in Vietnam, we send the troops. The troops haven't gone out since 1970. To me, that's a positive because I believe people should be left alone to work out their own kinds of struggles in these things. So, that hasn't happened. And until I see military forces, American military forces fighting abroad, I'll say that the 60s isn't dead. That's all. Until I see the troops out there. Yeah, that was a certain golden period. Innocent? It was innocent. I would not say it was not innocent. But I'd also say we were right. I'd say we were right. Most of the people that swung at me are gone on, Daley, Humphrey, Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover. They've gone to that great courtroom in the sky.
Richard Nixon is still hanging in there. How do you feel about Richard Nixon now, knowing that he's sitting out there in that house out in the West Coast?
I have a fairly philosophical view towards him, actually. I just see him as another victim. He's out of it. I don't like concentrating on him because he's out of power. It's almost when people are out of power, they're out of power, and I think everybody knows about Nixon. You see, when I was yelling at Nixon, you see, he was yelling back, and there nobody saying, that's where it was. We went through a famous trial in Chicago that was his doing. They just dreamt it up to get us. And he just dreamt us to put us in prison because we were opposing him. Before Watergate, there was Watergate, you see. It just wasn't, investigative reporting just wasn't the fad of the day. As it again is now, it's not so.
Definitely taking a turn down now.
We never were on the defense. And that's why, in a sense, I'm doing this interview. I'm not on the even though I'm on the run. You're supposed to go off, go to suburbs, collect your coupon. Boy, you done pay your dues, And I don't see it in that way. I see it as being offensive, being on the offense.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes. This is Direct News, and we'll be back with a final word after this. Next, on the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
I bumped into women that I spent some time with about 6 or 7 years. Now, I knew I was bad in the sack, but they didn't even remember me. They looked right through me. They didn't even remember me. My God.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes, a Direct News special edition, brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. This program was produced by Chris Stanley and Wendy Maxwell. Executive producers, Bob Meyerowitz and Peter Kalf. For Direct News in New York, Sandra Furton and Amy Gitlin. I'm Scott Muni. Direct News is a service of DIR Broadcasting. This is a Direct News special edition. DIR Broadcasting presents the Abbie Hoffman tapes.
Writing my autobiography, which would be out this winter, it was incredibly hard because it was, it was half biography, half autobiography. I love New York. I live underground, but I love New York.
By the time we got to Woodstock,
she said, if the police say you can come back, don't trust them. Don't trust them. Keep running.
won't you please come to Chicago?
We're going to jail, man. Let's go. All we will do is move forward, and if they lock us up, we lock it up, and God give us the breath to keep going. Let's go.
Writer, psychologist, civil rights worker, counterculture spokesperson, anti-war activist, and fugitive, Abbie Hoffman. The Abbie Hoffman tapes. His first face-to-face broadcast interview in 5 years. A Direct News special edition brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. And we'll be right back with part 5 after this. This is a Direct News special edition. I'm Scott Muni. Abbie Hoffman is America's best-known fugitive, a standout character of the turbulent 60s. Hoffman's involvement with the anti-war movement made him a culture hero. He wrote revolutionary handbooks, organized B-ins and smoke-ins, co-founded the Yippies, and was a defendant in the infamous Chicago 7 conspiracy trial. In late 1973, Abbie was busted on cocaine dealing charges. He claims it was a bum rap, and he jumped bail and vanished into the underground rather than risk a mandatory life sentence under the New York Rockefeller drug laws. He's been on the run ever since, and now lives under an alias in an unnamed small town, writing and doing local grassroots organizing against nuclear power. Direct News contacted people with underground connections late last year in hopes of coaxing Abbie out of the woodwork for a broadcast interview. After months of discussion and cloak and dagger security arrangements, Abbie met in a sleazy New York Times Square hotel with Direct News producer Chris Stanley and associate producer Sandra Furton. He talked for hours about his life underground, his politics, and his just completed autobiography titled Soon to Be a Major Motion Picture. This is the concluding segment of that interview, his first for broadcast in 5 years. Abbie Hoffman talks about his life on the run and about Anita and America, the wife and child he had to leave behind.
I've been everywhere.
You're in New York. Am I gathering this is the first time you've been in New York for a while?
No, I've been here a few times. I didn't come here for about 3 years. I thought I never could, and I think I came to Phil Oakes Memorial Concert. I went to that. It's my little private dedication to him. So that was the first time, but I was heavily sedated. And they cut my tongue out for friends. And I've been a few times since, actually.
When you left New York, when you took off, how long did it take you to calm down and got that city buzz away?
Well, I had an operation. I got my hair conked in Atlanta, and then I went cross country. It took me, then I started a whole reorientation about life. So I suppose it took about a year, actually. It took me about a year, really, to get a certain identity out of my existence. This life, living underground, living as an outlaw, is just about the closest you can come to schizophrenia and have some awareness of the process that's going on. So it is a control form of schizophrenia. So what you're talking to now is, I'm about 25% the other person, about 75% Abbie. I even choke every time I say the name, Why wasn't I given a name like Bob or John,
It must be so hard. Now, you've been doing this for...
Schmucky names. Now, I'll tell you, nobody ever remembers any of the names I use. But that one, working, being in the working class and working hard for a living is so exhausting. I guess you don't have time to think about the, some of the neurotic identity problems that, a lot of people around this town are hung up with. So I was a cook for a long time. I got fired unfair. I was upset because I really liked the job. I would have been content. I was, I wasn't washing dishes. I was hiding. I was a cook. And I was cooking, and I heard on the radio an article that I had in a magazine being advertised as Abbie. It was quite, so I ran across the street, and I got the article, and I brought it back, and it was like in a girly magazine. Is that what they call them now? It was
the one that was in Wee.
Yes, it was in Wee. It was the first one I wrote in Wee. It was about cracking up on the run. So all the guys in the kitchen were thinking I was looking at the girls and everything. But I would have been content to have that job and to be a success in it. And, it was just one of these, like, I only really accepted my first job was a teacher, but all the other jobs were sort of marginal jobs. And there's this huge, you get this incredible feeling that there's millions of people in America who are not in statistics, because they're not voting, they're not there, they're just like marginal workers, and they're not unionized. Of course, nobody's unionized, and you see, nobody in this country anyway. This country, there's 15% of working force is unionized. And now I'm talking about another thing that isn't even measured, this class almost migrant workers, and you're just totally at the mercy of the boss. It was just incredible. And so then I was I was collecting food stamps and unemployment lines and all that. And, then I became a success as a writer, etc. Writing my autobiography, which would be out this winter, it was incredibly hard because it was, it was half biography, half autobiography. It was very strange. I had to transport myself to the other person. I keep him in a little box, like a puppet, Charlie McCarthy. I just pull him out from broke. It's very weird for the woman I live with because we do the Superman trilogy in reverse. So she loves Clark Kent and super schmuck they tolerate.
That must be very strange to actually have an image of yourself that has gone on, and in fact, it is alive, in town. I mean, you see, there's T-shirts, and there's a rally being held, and the old face is up there, and then you see it, and every time there's a magazine article about you, there's pictures, and all the old stuff, and it's been so long since you've been like that. How do you relate to that character, the Abbie character?
I like him, but I would definitely relate to him as a him, and I talk about him as a him, and I write about him as a him.
Somebody else.
Well, not exactly, because I know that it's me. So it is, it is a persona, but it's very good for your mental growth because of your consciousness, because you are sort of evolving. You are sort of forced to evolve a new character, and it is kind of hard to live out everybody's expectations of that person. One of the trips about this is that, being a nobody virtually, although now where I live, I sort of have a role. I even have a last. I didn't have a last name for 2 years. It was that kind of valley. Hi, Fred, right? Fred, yeah, right. You go with Sally, yeah, I go with Sally, right? So it's Fred, Sally. There's only one Fred, imagine. There's only one Fred in the town, right? So nobody gets confused. So there's not, there's a limited amount of information. People just talk about the weather. I'm an expert on cold fronts, because there's not much to talk about. So you see the world before it sees you. That's essentially the difference between being someone who's known. And really, not too many people care about what you say. I was at a large party once about a year and a half ago. I was talking to this young woman, and we were talking about the 60s and everything. And, you're making conversation going, I'm giving my views. And she talks about the Chicago 7 trial, and she talks about Abbie Hoffman. And then I start to give my view, and she says, oh, excuse me, there's somebody I recognize, and walks right out of the conversation. I said, son of a bitch, I mean, speaking of, my God, I've been here in New York. I've bumped into women that I spent some time with about 6 or 7 years. Now I knew I was bad in the sack, but they didn't even remember me. They looked right through me. They didn't even remember me. My God. Was I ripped off? I mean, Jesus. Sex object. That was it. I mean, terrible.
There's one area we haven't talked about. I'd like to ask you about, and that's your family. What's happening with your family? What's happened to Anita? What's happened to America? Do you see them very much? What is that part of your life like?
It's we're all friends, and we're all part of the same community, and we're all in love, and we all miss each other. I really can't talk much about it. I do see him every once in a while, but not as much as I want. I see just about everybody once in a while, but not as... I just saw I had a very moving experience because I have this 98-year-old grandmother. So I go to see my bubby. That's what we call grandmothers in Yiddish. And my friend got all the relatives out of the room and everything, and I was alone with her. She sort of lifted herself up and she said,
I go, so I tell you,
she's indicating that she can be trusted. See, with that old ghetto thing, she's going to die. She's been threatening that for the last 20 years. But she's going to go, so this is just between me and you.
She said, if the police say you can come back, don't trust them. Don't trust them. Keep running. Keep running.
And she's waving to me, and she's like talking like she's 17 years old. And that's what she wanted. I mean, it was very, I had tears in my eyes. I was very moved.
This was recently you saw her.
Yes. Yes. Well, I wanted to see the Red Sox beat the Yankees in Yankee Stadium, and the Red Sox lost 10-0. It was, but I got to see my grandmother.
Do you get to see America enough that you've
I love
developed?
New York. Hey, I love New York. I live underground, but I love New York. Right. Forgot that. You got to watch that, with baseball and,
Yeah, I mean, you want them to welcome you back here, don't you?
Hey.
Do you get to see America enough that you've developed some kind of a relationship with him? Because he was so young when you left.
Oh, yes. We're very close. There's a book out called Kids, and there's a picture in it of me and him with both our masks, and it says, kids can do anything. And that's it. He understands the whole thing perfectly, what's happened. He understands who's to blame and who's not. And he'll be some revolutionary when he grows up. He'll feel true to his name.
The Abbie Hoffman tapes. This is Direct News, and we'll be back with a final word after this. The Abbie Hoffman tapes, a Direct News special edition, brought to you by High Times, the magazine of high society. This program was produced by Chris Stanley and Wendy Maxwell. Executive producers, Bob Meyerowitz and Peter Kalf. For Direct News in New York, Sandra Furton and Amy Gitlin. I'm Scott Muni. Direct News is a service of DIR Broadcasting.